Hello, everyone. Welcome to our last session for the 5th annual KinCan conference. My name is Grant, and I'm a professor of kinesiology at the University of Moncton in Moncton, New Brunswick. Also, I'm a member of the CKA Board of Directors, and I'm representing the New Brunswick Kinesiology Association. For this session, as I said, our last session, we welcome John Gray, a registered kinesiologist, who will present Are You Competent? A Practitioner's Career Guide to Kinesiology Scope, Competence, and Professional Education for a Successful Career. As a reminder, this session is presented in English with simultaneous interpretation available in French. To listen to this session translated in French, click on the 3 dots at the bottom of the screen and select the globe that says Interpretation. Select the language you would like to listen in, and make sure you click on Mute Original Audio to not have both superimposed. Thank you for your attention, and we'll have a question and answer period at the end of the presentation.
Thank you, Grant. Thank you, everybody, as well, for spending your time here with me on a Sunday afternoon-ish, depending on where you are, evening in some cases. And I'm really happy to be able to close off the conference with this talk, because what I hope to do is kind of maybe bring some ideas together, maybe clarify some questions you might have based on some of the previous conversations or presentations that were provided. So if you haven't met me before, and I've done a couple of these talks, but a little bit about me. I've been about 30 years in clinical practice in Toronto. I'm an RKin. I started quite a while ago. I got my undergraduate degree in the early 90s. In 2001, I was the OKA president and was part of the group, along with Katie Wadden who we saw yesterday, to be the group, part of the team that applied for regulation and was successful. Once the college was formed, I was on the inaugural CKO Council for the College of Kinesiologists, that is, and we'll go in a little bit about that. And right around that time, we started taking a look at ways to really evaluate the competency level of kinesiologists in Ontario. So I began, helping out with the peer and practice assessments. So I was actually going and I was meeting people face to face. They were often 4-hour-long meetings before pre-COVID. Did that for a little over 8 years, and particularly they used me when I was evaluating the practices of the athletic therapists and exercise therapists who are also RKins. As Grant said, this year I'm the CKA president. I'm very happy to be here and fulfill that role this year. I hope that we've got some really good things coming forward for you, even at a provincial level. Now, regardless of my background, I do want to kind of reflect that this presentation is really about my own kind of experiences and opinions. I'm not speaking on behalf of the CKA here. I'm not speaking on behalf of the college or any of the other groups that I was involved with in the past. But my opinions have been definitely informed by them. I'm also going to be bringing along a couple of friends and colleagues in the way of a video clip on some of my slides, because I'm a big believer on not having you kind of take my word for anything. So what I want to do is show that kind of like more of an exposure of the different topics across different people. So what we're going to cover today, I want to talk a bit about the scope of practice of kinesiology. It's a very big topic. A lot of people say it's a very big scope. We'll go into that. And I want to talk about scope versus small s scope, or air quotes scope, versus competence, because I think a lot of the times when we're hearing some presentations today, what we're referring to as a scope of practice is actually more appropriately referred to as the competencies that an individual might have. And do you need a certification in order to get those competencies? And then ultimately, how do I find the right education and training in order to do what I want to in my career? So the parents in the crowd are going to automatically have a little song going off in the back of their head now that they're going to have for the rest of the day, and I apologize. But which one of these things is not like the other? Now, you might be thinking in terms of like scopes of practice or anything else, but structurally speaking, It's the CKA that's not a certification body. We don't have a course. We don't make you take a test at this point. And it's right in the name of the exercise physiologist and athletic therapist is that they're certified. Whereas, as it's been mentioned earlier, we don't follow that model. So we've all had to have that conversation with relative or another person. You talk about the old elevator speech when somebody asks you, what is a kinesiologist or what is kinesiology? And we'll often refer to, we'll compare ourselves against other groups. So let's talk about what it is not first. The big thing when we're talking about the scope of practice of kinesiology is it's not a discipline or science. And, Dr. Fowles made a very good observation. The fact was that there's an academic definition and there's a professional definition. Once you graduate, you really fall under the professional definition of the scope. And it was actually written into health law in Ontario in 2007, as was also previously presented. The second thing that we're not, and again, I feel like my thunder's been stolen here. We're not an exercise profession. I was expecting some gasps or some icons floating up my screen or whatever. But the fact is, we incorporate exercise in our practices or in our profession, but we're not an exercise profession. We're a health profession. And the CK is not a certifying body, as I mentioned. And yes, it's already been said. This one is we're, as a health profession, I want you to think about how you would approach your career, considering that if you were to embark on a career as a health professional, what would that look like differently than an exercise professional? So this is where we're going to head. Now, more of the confusion that comes along with this is that oftentimes you say like, well, what's a profession versus an occupation versus a job or a title, etc. You've all had that experience. You all knew the person who was a student forever when you were doing your undergrad and you referred to them as a professional student. Or it was that PhD student who was like in their 14th year of doing their PhD and they just never seemed to be able to leave, and you would call, oh, they're a professional student. The fact is, a lot of these terms get thrown around pretty loosely. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're accurate. So if I can just use this as an opportunity to kind of explain a little bit about why kinesiology is a profession. We've clearly identified at a regulatory level, there's a distinct body of knowledge for kinesiology, and there's one scope of practice for kinesiology, and that is kind of across the board for all health professions, whether it's nursing or physiotherapy. And even in the case in physiotherapy, where you say, look, physiotherapy and chiropractic are virtually the same, but they've actually been able to write very distinctive scopes of practice. We're going to talk a little bit more about what it is a bit later as well. Below that, you have occupations, which are kind of a list of, there's a content, there's a knowledge base, but then there's also more. Here's where we start to see the competencies being discussed. Now, in the first case, in the scope of practice, we don't talk about competencies at all. It's a broad statement that should discuss kind of like where we work in our area, possibly how we approach our services, but it should be general enough to allow for innovation and growth of the profession. And if we're just, the important thing is that it's not a list of competencies, because they would automatically stifle any future growth or innovation. We would never be able to grow and develop new things or new competencies, new areas of our practice. And this is important to consider when people say, well, that's not in my scope, or my scope doesn't include that. The fact is, you're talking about your sphere of competency, which is more of an occupational title. So occupations, what you'll see is those people will do similar things regardless of where they are in Canada. And then lastly, you have jobs where you have very distinct rules or competencies as well. The important thing about competencies for me to bring out right here is that in a previous presentation, there was a list of like, well, here are the kin competencies with the number of competencies in this other area over here. There are more, there are different, etc. The kin competencies are really the essential competencies that have been, and they're actually 54, just to correct that information. but they're only the essential ones. And for you to take on a profession, to go into a particular practice area, as you continue to learn and grow and gain more competencies, or gain more experience and skill, you gain more competencies. And so 54 is where you start. Those are the ones that we really assess you on. In not only in Ontario, but as you'll know, if you've seen the CKA website recently, this is where we it's actually been adapted across Canada. So everybody likes a good origin story. There hasn't been a Marvel movie that's come out in a little while yet, so this is probably a bad comparison, but I'm using Canadian Physiotherapy Association as an example. So most health professions start this way. They start off with a group of practitioners who are all doing something, and then they go, hey, let's like assemble like the Avengers, and they decide that they're going to start doing things like making standards of practice. They're going to decide on what you need to know in order to be part of their group. What they're going to, what you're going to need to do in order to stay a part of the group, etc. And then from there, it turns into an academic program. Okay, and this is exactly in the physiotherapy case. Post World War II in particular, and because of a polio epidemic, this is exactly how it went. You had individuals working in hospitals who then ended up becoming an association, and it wasn't until after that that they ended up having academic programs. We did the exact opposite. So what happened was we first started off with the kin programs, notably Waterloo and Simon Fraser. Graduates from those programs ended up working in the field and then specializing and becoming what you noticed at the second level would have been like the Ontario Kinesiology Association, BCAK, and other provinces that have developed their associations, and you're leading to individuals working in practice. I'd like to introduce to you first of my colleagues. Connie is probably the most important person to kinesiology in Canada, definitely in terms of its growth. Gladly, she's still involved. She's still helping different PKAs involved with continue to make forward progress. She was notably the first the president of the Transitional Council for the College of Kinesiologists. And this is the group that actually made the College of Kinesiologists of Ontario. Okay, and so I've got a little video clip of her, and she's going to kind of share a perspective that's super important here.
One of the challenges that we faced when we tried to pursue regulation was that our university educators were very stuck on it being a discipline and being a research-based program. And yet there were so many of us graduating, it wasn't feasible that we were all going to go off and, do more research. There were those of us who said, hey, this is like great material. And, I was fortunate. I did have one amazing prof who said, you know so much, go off and use it, do some good in the world. I took that to heart, went off and worked, and I've helped lots of people along the way, at least I hope so, and done what I can. And it's great that we have such a solid science foundation, because with it, we don't, accept that we're just going to, apply one series of treatment. What we look at is figuring out what the real problem is and then building a solution. And that's the difference between being a professional and a technician. And I think some of the so-called healthcare professionals have become technicians. They apply the same thing to the same problem over and over again and don't dig deeper to find out what's the different thing here that we could be doing that would really help this individual or this group of people. So I think that's a strength coming out of kin, that we've got such a huge discipline foundation. And that's what it is. It's a foundation. And on top of that, then, is the profession. And we stand on that solid foundation.
Okay. You might have noticed in the previous, I'll come back to some of those points that were also on that screen a little bit later. This is one of my favorite memes that I've created. And we'll talk about this back here. Having a scope of practice isn't enough. Okay, we have to be able to competently deliver services that are within our scope of practice. And so I'd like to ask you Question: when is the last time you've ever seen your doctor or heard of a doctor performing a spine manipulation? This is a clear case where this actually falls within their scope of practice, but you don't see them do that because these people identify that. I'm not trained to do that, and I don't actually, to tell you the truth, I know a lot of chiropractors who don't do these anymore either. And I know the more kind of obvious example for us is often when's the last time you knew of a doctor prescribing exercise? And Austin's presentation talked specifically about that, which was fantastic. Some other examples: massage therapy, prescribing exercise, and secondly, lastly, a physio provided cognitive behavior therapy. Now, I want to take this just quick opportunity to talk about like how much of your education actually needs to be able to deliver your full competencies that you're going to be utilizing in practice. The reality is, physiotherapists hold themselves out as the world experts in therapeutic exercise or rehab exercise. Yet I gotta honestly say, there's a 100% case of every physiotherapist who I know, the first certification they took when they graduated, literally in the same year they graduated, they were right at McMaster University getting trained in acupuncture, which they didn't come anywhere near in their formal training. So that's a bit of the counter argument about to say, like, do you really need your undergraduate programs dictating exactly every piece of information you need to know in order to apply as a professional? The vast majority of the cases, you talk to any health professional who's out there working for 5-10 years, and they're using very, very little of what they learned in their undergrad or their formal training, and more about what they've picked up along the way, as long as it falls within their scope. So, superstar number 2. This is Xana. She's a family health team kinesiologist, and this clip was taken out of a podcast that I did last year. It's up on the Ontario Kinesiology Association's YouTube channel if you want to see it. It's about 45 minutes long, and I actually interviewed 3. You're going to meet another family health team kin a little bit later in the presentation as well. So discussing the whole notion about scope of practice and competency, and the fact that we all have the same competence. We all have the same scope of practice. Well, here's Xana.
I think kinesiology, you can think of a lot like different kinds of nurses. They all have the same undergraduate degree, but different nurses work in different places. And a nurse that works in an ICU and a nurse that works in, the primary health team where I work have very different experiences and competence. And a nurse that is managing an event one day is probably not the nurse the next day who is doing someone's PAP or giving vaccines to babies. They're both nurses. They have the same scope of practice, but their competency is very different.
Which is a really important thing to think about, considering that undergraduate degrees in kinesiology teach you more than just exercise physiology. We go into a certain amount of biomechanics and ergonomics, which is actually not really kind of expected from the physiology side of things. Now, this is a great story. Sorry, I've got two screens here. I'd like you to introduce you to Yasmin. So Yasmin here, you'll notice she's an athletic therapist, and I put in here on the bottom left, they were really happy that they hired her, clearly. She came into the Vernon Vipers with a very strong career, like very strong competencies, great experience, wonderful references. She was a leader in the athletic therapy for the league, and she was actually even, sorry, I got something in my throat. She was even actually identified by the league to lead the combine testing for their athletes for the year. Importantly, she's not a CAT, yet she outperformed virtually all of her colleagues who were. And this is a case where an employer identified that competency does not necessarily mean, it does not equate to certification. And so, has to be, if we have time in the chat, ask me about her story. It's kind of funny. So, how do you become competent? Well, the stuff that we're always talking about is, the knowledge piece, formal courses in reading, your undergraduate degree coming from a strong program. But the stuff that we don't talk about, though, oftentimes, and the stuff, we don't want to obligate you to spend a lot of money going back, taking time off of work, investing in expensive books and those kinds of things. Not all the time. It's often a very good idea. But, things like peer mentoring, Facebook groups are a great opportunity to do that. I'll share the Facebook group that I'm a kind of director or kind of moderator on at the end of this presentation. But networking could either be done in person or through Facebook groups. Primarily, what happens is you ask somebody and you say, "Oh, that's a really interesting thing that you do. Where did you learn how to do that? Or have you read this book or whatever?" And then you kind of you build your knowledge base from that. Subscriptions to newsletters and online education. The Better Clinician Project here, there's no connection to them. Any number of podcasts that are out there that you can listen to. I would strongly advise you to listen to podcasts by other health professionals who are working in maybe areas that you'd be interested in. So listen to the doctors, listen to the chiros, listen to the physios. Tune in, find out what they're talking about, who they're reading. Okay. From the skill set, in-person workshops are really, really important. And although, we're doing a lot more virtually, it's super important that if you're going to be learning a hands-on skill or some kind of even like motivational interviewing or different things that involve any interaction, that you're actually doing it, interacting with somebody so that you can get some feedback from that and develop your skill there. Supervised learning is another one. So again, with the Ontario Kinesiology Association YouTube channel a couple of years ago, it's a bit clickbaity, but I had kind of told somebody, the president at the time, we motivated a conversation video that ended up, it was supposed to be 20 minutes, it ended up going on about 45. And so I had kind of used the statement that PTA job's probably going to be the best job that most kinesiologists will ever have. So clearly that didn't go over well initially. But the point that I was saying was, everybody usually says, "Oh, I want to go and I want to, volunteer at this sport med clinic or etc." And there you learn, you get exposure to a bunch of things, but everything it tends to be very arm's length. But what happens if you could just go somewhere and you could negotiate that you are going to be learning things, you're going to get paid for it, and you're going to be under the direct supervision of a mentor who might not be a kin, it could be something else, it could be a physio or a chiro or an MD, and you're going to be learning those skills. But that's a negotiation point that you would make sure you address before even agreeing to that job. Anyway, okay, YouTube channel if you want to see that more. The other thing is practice with your colleagues. You took a course in stretching. Stretch out have them give you feedback. Learn how to have them watch you do some techniques, or even like interviewing. Any kind of skill that you might learn, get feedback from somebody, either as the person you're doing it to or from the side. The piece that is often left out, particularly when you're talking about like certification bodies, etc., they always talk about knowledge, skills, and abilities, or knowledge, skills, and experience. The thing about experience is you could do something wrong for 20 years and still be terrible at it and not show any judgment. Judgment is actually, if you refer back to Brian's from the CKO, his presentation yesterday, talked a lot about judgment. That's really the cornerstone of competency, like knowing when to apply that, when not to. How do you do that? Well, case studies. If you're involved in a multidisciplinary group, oftentimes you'll have in-services. You'll go over, different case studies that people, of clients that people might be seeing. Reflective practice. Go back into your own charts. Take a look at what you're doing. Make sure that has your knowledge kind of moved on. Should you go back and revisit certain things? Why couldn't you answer certain questions for clients? Why were they having a hard time getting the expected kind of progress? Courses on clinical decision-making and evidence-based practice are also important. You can find a lot of that for free on YouTube. And again, I believe I have 2 videos with Rebecca Adaman, who's now a professor somewhere, hopefully in Canada. And we did a couple of short videos on that, but also role modeling client scenarios. You're having a colleague or a supervisor or somebody you work with pretending to be the client and then go through. And that might be really important in terms of having them kind of give you a scenario that you would then kind of try to interpret and decide on, and you could get feedback from them on how to do that. So there's not a way. Here's the thing that's super important here, though, is that in the kinesiology profession, we're not telling you where to go for these competencies. Okay, if you're certified by a group, by any organization, any association, they're going to have the competencies within there. But the thing is, that certification body doesn't speak for other certification bodies. Think about personal training, for example. And the fact is that in exercise physiology, you in North America, you have access to 4 different certifications you could potentially go to. And the best one that you might want to go to, assuming you want to do that, is really up to you and to your needs, where you are in your career, and the information that they're going to provide and the training that they're going to be able to provide. So as I go through, I talk about how, sometimes certifications are important. What you'll know in the health professions world, a lot of the certifications are multidisciplinary. And the fact is that overlapping scopes are essential to good practice. You definitely need to be able to share competencies with other health professions. And these are just some of the ones that I just pull, off of the internet, swipe their logos. But if you're working with diabetes, people with diabetes, you could become a certified diabetes educator. And guess who else are certified diabetes educators? Nurses, physiotherapists, occupational therapists, dietitians become certified diabetes educators. Zana is a certified bariatric educator in her family health team, and she saw that as an appropriate certification for her to get. BoneFit has 2 levels, the clinical and the fitness certification. I would encourage you to go for the higher of the 2, as same with GLAD, and the other 2, Arthritis Health Professions Association. But what you see here is topics that are very specific, and kinesiologists who are working with people who have arthritis. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of them, but there are also going to be a lot of kinesiologists who aren't. They're going to be looking for something else. So it's important for you to consider that. Meet Holly. She's a family health team kin who also is part of this podcast. And we'll just get right to what she has to share with us today.
The courses that I take are basically guided by the needs of my community. So whatever is kind of like showing up as referrals, or whatever we're kind of seeing more of, maybe in the ER or in primary care in the doctor's offices, that's kind of what will lead me to learn more about a certain topic. So for example, as I mentioned before, like if I'm getting like lots of shoulder pain, like that's going to prompt me to take a shoulder course. Or if, for example, we're seeing more heart disease, I'm going to look into maybe offering cardiac rehab, which we've recently done, and kind of exploring down cardiovascular health role in terms of my education too. Because I mean, the one thing about, I'm sure you guys have all noticed, like in terms of movement education, health in general, things are changing all the time. So it is really important to keep up to date with the latest knowledge of everything. So even if you took a course 5 or 10 years ago, it's never a bad thing to update that same course or a similar course, because chances are some of the recommendations have changed, or there's new tips and tricks to help advance your population in the right direction.
So super important stuff to consider, and whether or not you are going to use a competent certification to find that is a highly personal decision, and really not, doesn't really have anything else, no other real things you should consider other than where you want to go with your career. I'm going to leave this, the last video with Connie, who I think really kind of underlines the whole point of this presentation.
Because here we are back to credential creep, and what does this mean? And at the end of the day, it's, do you have the right skill set to provide the care that people deserve? So, we can debate that all around, but we've gotten hung up on credentialing versus actually having people provide care. And we've got to be careful because, one of the other things that we're seeing emerge in healthcare in general is that people are going in and they're not ready to, they don't want to come out and practice. They want to come out and manage. So we talk about our healthcare professions shortages, but the shortages are on frontline people. They're on the people to do the hands-on work day in, day out, and it's across every profession. So, if I wanted to say anything to my kin colleagues, it's don't be afraid to actually practice, to actually do the hands-on work, because that's what's needed most. And, I'm hoping long-term we'll see better rewards for doing that. But, I saw a good dozen people this last week, doing ergonomics with them. And the number of people who said, thank you, gosh, you made a difference just being here today and doing a few things. And there was, and the relationship's going to continue in terms of work we have to do together. But, take that away. You've just made somebody feel a bit better, be a bit more productive. Maybe, at the end of the day, they've got some energy left to enjoy themselves. So, those are positive things to take away, that you have such power to impact people's lives by being a hands-on practitioner. Because
So the question on everybody's mind is, do you actually need a certification? So let's talk about reasons why you might. Well, the job you want asks for it. Usually that's because the person who is doing the hiring has it. But on less of a tongue-in-cheek, role here, the fact is some of these actually have industry standard awareness. Now, I don't want you to get the impression that I'm against the CEP or the CAT, as they're absolutely excellent certifications. I think that kinesiologists who hold those certifications are definitely demonstrating through the industry standard that they've become, that they have a specific interest in advancing their knowledge and their competencies in those practice areas. Like we talked about before, certifications add to your profession, your professional training. They are not a substitute. And I think this is where the person was going a little earlier with the comment about kids not being able to be called qualified exercise professionals. I think oftentimes what happens is somebody who's a kin will actually start referring to themselves instead as the other thing, whether that might be an AT or QEP or what that might be. The college's perspective is likely you're first a kin, and then everything that follows it illustrates your advanced training in a particular area of practice. And definitely if it's an industry standard, that's actually ideal. That's great. If you're not employed by a company, it allows you to market your service to potential businesses, especially if that industry standard awareness actually is appreciated by your potential customers or clients. And the fact is that it's often a really time-efficient way to learn new material if you just go through the course. And as we said before, certifications enhance your sphere of competence, but they do not separately define your scope of practice. Questions. Does it improve your competence in any area of practice? I would be interested in knowing from, is it Carmela? I'm sorry, I'm forgetting her name. Yeah, Carmela. If she felt that doing the CEP actually gave her more things to, more knowledge or made her do her job better. I can tell you that Xana, every family health team kin who I met, every cardiac rehab person I ever assessed as a pure in practice assessor for the college, anybody working in a clinical realm, none of them had CEPs. The CEPs that I did do pure in practice assessments normally were in more of a fitness kind of like chronic. Basically, they're working with people who had known controlled chronic illnesses, but it was like it was another kind of credential in addition to working in the fitness world. So it didn't necessarily have probably what it was intended to do, which was more cardiac rehab focused personnel. But at least at that time in Toronto, in Ontario, it was not a hiring, it was not a point that they were looking for in hiring. If that's changed, kudos to CSEP and to Zach Weston for doing that. But the fact is the people who did the hiring identified that other competencies were able to be found that worked for them. It might be that where you are in your career, you would look at it as saying, well, it's a good review, like Holly had referred to. It's 5-10 years, and it's like, hey, maybe it's time that I do that certification. And just to remind myself a lot of the background information that's there. I think it'd be really useful. Now, they're not always available to everybody. So especially if you live in a remote area, is there any other way you could achieve the same outcome? A lot of people just go and get the textbooks and study independently, or you can do some of the other ways that we discussed for building your knowledge base. And the fact is that a lot of, now I'm not picking on AT or exercise physiology here, but in other areas of practice, many of these certifications, which are basically just study and write a multiple choice test, they don't actually test your judgment component. And so it's questionable whether or not these certifications are actually going to be developing your actual competence, because they do leave out the judgment piece. So take-home points as I wrap this up. Put home in air quotes because you're already home, most of you, if not all, I'm sure. So there's nothing to take anywhere. But while you're sitting down, we need to recognize that all kinesiologists have the same scope of practice. Okay, our professional competencies will depend on many factors, whether you're in ergonomics, occupational health and safety, if you're doing something in a neuro capacity, movement retraining, working with children, working with the elderly, etc. Those, like Xana's example of the nurses, your jobs could look completely different. But I'm pretty sure if you have an exercise physiologist who's working in, one on each coast, their jobs are looking quite close to each other. Certifications are often a really great way for you to add to your professional competencies, but they don't guarantee them. You have to be a good consumer of your healthcare, education, and your professional development. Finally, seek out training that specifically improves your judgment, such as in-person interactive learning. Even if it's just you decided you want to create a study group with some friends that you have, and just go over and then try to work together. You don't have to spend tons of money on this. Sometimes the free way is the best way, because it really, the more you can put yourself out there and you really want to, kind of play with fire, get out there and try to take a course with some physios and chiros in MSK. And, it makes you stretch a little bit more and really kind of, work to really kind of get the most out of that experience. So thank you very much for your attention. I really appreciate it. If you want to get a hold of me, social media basically is John Gray Arkin. LinkedIn seems to be the best one. I did talk to you about a Facebook group. I am a co-moderator of a group called MSK Kinesiologists. We are literally only kins are on this Facebook group. We want to help to improve the competency level, the knowledge base, open up conversation with people. Tell us what you want to learn. It's for free, and it's an open dialogue, a nice, easy place for people to get information and participate. So with that, I will pass it back to Grant. Thank you very much.
John, thank you for your presentation and an informed perspective on scope of practice, competency, and I think it goes well with the other presentations this weekend that you referenced during your presentation. So we'll go to some questions. I got a couple of questions here. We're going to answer one by Aaron Patrick, which is The question is, can you explain why health authorities require registration with local or provincial kinesiology associations in addition to a CEP designation?
So the thing about a CEP designation that is really, let's just say, really alluring or really, really interesting to a hiring body is this competence thing. Like this is something we know, we feel comfortable with the content that's in there, but that's not enough to guarantee that the person's going to be able to operate in that environment. The other piece that certification bodies cannot offer is the regulatory piece, or like the accountability piece. So there's a huge amount of accountability for regulated health professions. The fact is, other PKAs, even though they're not regulated, also have a regulatory component. BC in particular, they've been identified as a regulatory body by our insurance policies and also by BC Ministry of Health. The fact is that gives them the confidence to say, they've got skin in the game. Basically, the best thing a certification body might be able to do is just say you're not allowed to, be a member of our group anymore. But if there's real accountability behind that person's practice, whether it's, if they're negligent in any way, if they perform some kind of a technique incorrectly or whatever, you've got some real recourse against them. That's why you'll often see the two put together.
Thank you. We've got another question here. You talked a lot about the importance of judgment in determining competency. Do you have any suggestions or a nice way to kind of summarize what types of methods or tools can kinesiologists use to self-assess? Because it's something that's difficult to do, to identify your own weaknesses. And if you leave it just to yourself, I feel like a lot of people might not have that ability to critically self-assess.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's true. Well, I mean, a self-assessment, it's kind of self-explanatory. If you follow some kind of a structure, now I think that the College of Kinesiologists of Ontario have one but unfortunately it's behind a like a password protected wall. But there are other models that are out there that I'm sure people are going to be able to find. I think possibly if I can like put my CKA hat back on, this is probably something we should make sure that people have available to them as well, because we do have a continuing education standards program. And really, I mean, who cares what course you take every year? Like, if it's not actually helping you move in the direction that you want to with your career, that course is really just lost money. And so identifying, and then also the beautiful thing about this, the competency framework or self-assessment framework that you might be able to do would be to see that track record. But talk to colleagues. If you need objective opinion, talk to colleagues, talk to supervisors, ask questions of them, and seek feedback. And that's really the other way I think you could go about that.
Thank you for that. Another question is, let's say you suspect that you have a colleague that might not be competent, or that you know of someone that's practicing as a kinesiologist, but doing things outside of their competencies and their scope of practice. What kind of action do you think a kinesiologist should do? Because ultimately it's going to harm the profession, and it's also going to harm potentially members of the public.
Yeah, exactly. Well, in Ontario, we're required to report them. They're not even very like, it's not like, having an old lady, an old client of yours or whatever, bringing you cookies at Christmas. They're very strict about this. Like if you see any kind of like inappropriate behavior, you're required to do that. Otherwise you could get in trouble yourself. Outside of Ontario, however, I mean, I think that, this is your colleague. You should maybe kind of raise the point to them. The thing is that if you're from an unregulated profession, really the worst thing that could possibly happen to you would be that they get removed from their from the association, where it could possibly have a backlash to them. And again, in my opinion, what you would do specifically with that person would be, I would have a conversation with them and say, listen, this is really obvious, this is what's going on. The risks are, like, if you're out of the association and unable to access appropriate insurance policy, you might not be able to work in your field any longer. And especially if their membership in their PKA or their registration with the body, like the college, for example, is a requirement of their employment. But it is, yeah, the levers really kind of drop off once we go away from regulation.
Excellent, thank you. That's it for time. Not to end on a negative note, I mean, about, people practicing without a level of competency, but I think it's an important point to discuss. I also think that there's a lot of interesting issues that were raised in this presentation and other presentations that I hope will motivate people to get involved and continue the work of developing the profession, professional pathways for kinesiologists. There's a lot of potential, there's a lot of interest, and there's a lot of people that are working hard to move this message forward. This brings an end to our presentation. Thank you very much, John, for your presentation. And it also simultaneously wraps up the KinCan conference, the 5th annual. So on behalf of the CKA, I would like to take a minute here, just to thank everyone for attending this session and all the other sessions this weekend. If you want to watch a session or watch one that you didn't get a chance to watch, you have access to the recordings after the conference is complete. Again, thank you for your participation and support this year. Please contact the CKA if you have any questions or comments, and we look forward to connecting with you in the future. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. Thank you.